Chapter 1. The wedding breakfast lasted 2 hours and 14 minutes, which Eleanor Garrick knew because she had counted every one of them. She had also counted the forks, which numbered 9 at each setting and seemed, frankly, aggressive. She had counted the guests, 43, most of whom were looking at her with the particular expression one reserves for a curiosity one has paid to see. She had counted the windows, the candles, and the precise number of times her new husband had addressed her directly since the ceremony. Twice. Once to offer his arm, once to pass the salt. She was, as of 11 o'clock that morning, the Duchess of Hartmere. She was also, as of 11 o'clock that morning, the most comprehensively ignored woman in the north of England. The Duke sat at the far end of a table that could comfortably seat 30, and today held 43 people who were all, to varying degrees, pretending this was a love match. He was tall, dark-haired, and possessed of the kind of face that looked as though it had been designed by a man who admired straight lines and distrusted ornament. His jaw could have been used to true a plumb line. His eyes were the gray-green of a winter sea and approximately as warm. His mouth had a way of almost reaching amusement without ever quite arriving, as though the smile had been proposed, considered, and declined on procedural grounds. He wore his wedding clothes with the air of a man who had dressed for a funeral and been informed, too late, that it was something else entirely. Nell, as she had been known to every living person until this morning, watched him from behind her 9th fork, and thought that if a man could be described as architecturally committed to indifference, Piers Cavell, 6th Duke of Hartmere, was that man. He was also, she noted with the precision of a woman who had kept accounts since the age of 14, drinking his wine at exactly the rate that prevented anyone from refilling his glass. That required calculation. A man who calculated his wine intake at his own wedding breakfast was either very careful or very miserable, and she suspected both. She herself was drinking water. Someone had to be sober enough to remember which of these 43 smiling faces was genuinely pleased, and which was simply too well-bred to stare openly at the baronet's daughter, who had, by some mechanism the county had not yet deciphered, become a duchess. The mechanism, as it happened, was quite simple. Nell's father, Sir William Garrick, had been the old Duke's closest friend and land agent for 30 years. When Sir William died, he left behind 3 things of consequence: a daughter with no fortune, a debt of £300 to the Hartmere estate, and a letter, written in his final week, extracting a promise from the old Duke to see to Eleanor's future. The old Duke had agreed. Then the old Duke had died, leaving the promise and the debt and the daughter to his son, who had regarded all 3 with the expression of a man presented with a problem of drainage, and had solved it the way he solved everything, thoroughly, completely, and without reference to the feelings of anyone involved. He had proposed marriage on a Tuesday. He had proposed it the way one might propose the rerouting of a stream, with plans, terms, and a notable absence of sentiment. A settlement of £300 would have cleared the debt, but it would not have cleared the promise, and the promise was the thing that would not let him sleep. Moreover, his steward had just absconded with 2 years of falsified accounts. The estate was hemorrhaging money he could not trace, and Eleanor Garrick was, by every report he had received from his father, the most capable household manager in the north of England. He needed competence as badly as she needed standing. The marriage solved both problems at once, which was efficient, which was what Piers valued above all things except honor, which was what had got him into this situation in the first place. There would be no shared bed. There would be no heir from this union, a matter he would address through other legal means. There would be separate quarters, separate lives, and a shared name that would give her standing, security, and the authority to manage the Hartmere household, which, he noted with the first hint of something that was almost embarrassment, was in a state that could charitably be described as administrative chaos. She would be Duchess in name. He would be Duke, in fact. The arrangement would suit them both. Nell had listened to this proposal in the parlor of her father's house, which was mortgaged, sitting in her father's chair, which had a broken spring, wearing her father's watch, which was the only thing of value she had left, and she had done the arithmetic of her situation with the speed and accuracy that had made her indispensable to every employer she would never be allowed to have. She could refuse. She could be pitied, which was worse than being poor, because at least poverty had a kind of privacy to it. She could become a governess and teach other people's children to play the pianoforte while pretending she had never been a gentleman's daughter. She could depend on the charity of cousins who had not written in 6 years and would not start now. Or she could say yes. "I accept your terms, your grace," she had said, and the Duke had nodded once, as though she had agreed to a sensible modification of the crop rotation, and that had been that. The wedding breakfast ended. The guests departed in a long procession of carriages and good wishes, and the faint, sweet poison of speculation. The great hall of Hartmere emptied like a theater after the last act, and Nell stood in the entrance hall of a house she had lived in for 4 hours and looked up at a staircase wide enough to drive a cart through and thought, with the particular clarity that comes to a person who has just done something irrevocable, "Well, here we are then." The housekeeper, Mrs. Firth, appeared with the silent efficiency of a woman who had survived 3 dukes and intended to survive a 4th. She was perhaps 60, with the face of a woman who had once been handsome and was now something better, formidable. "Your rooms are prepared, Your Grace. Shall I show you up?" "Your Grace." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. "Thank you, Mrs. Firth. I should like that." The Duchess's chambers were on the east side of the house, separated from the Duke's by a single door. The door was locked from his side, a single bolt with a single key. Piers had given her that key on a plain iron ring that morning, along with the household keys, and had said, with the careful formality of a man handing over a deed of trust, "The door between our rooms. You hold the only key. It will not be opened from my side." She had thanked him. She had put the key on her chatelaine, where it hung beside the still-room key and the cellar key and the linen cupboard key, and she had not mentioned it again. It was, she supposed, a gesture of respect. It was also the loneliest thing anyone had ever given her, and she had been given a great many lonely things in her 26 years, so the competition was considerable. She stood now in the Duchess's sitting room, which was large enough to contain her father's entire house and seemed to know it, and she listened. Through the locked door, faintly, she could hear footsteps. They crossed the room. They paused. They crossed the room again. The Duke of Hartmere was pacing. Nell sat down in a chair that was worth more than her trousseau, folded her hands, and counted his footsteps the way she had once counted pennies, which was to say, carefully, and without hope of there being enough. The Dowager Duchess of Hartmere arrived 4 days later, which was 3 days sooner than anyone had expected, and at least a week sooner than her grandson had wished. She was 83 years old. She had outlived 2 husbands, 1 king, and the better part of a century, and she had done so with a spine like a bayonet and a tongue that could etch glass. She arrived in a coach that was older than most of the footmen, accompanied by a maid who was only slightly younger than she was, and a small terrier of uncertain breed and absolute conviction. She walked into the entrance hall of Hartmere, looked up at the staircase, looked down at the floor, looked at Mrs. Firth, looked at the footman who was attempting to take her cloak, and said, "The brass wants doing." Then she looked at Nell. The dowager's eyes were the same gray-green as her grandson's, but where his were winter sea, hers were winter sea that had seen every ship ever launched upon it, and was not impressed by a single one. "So," she said, "you are the girl." "I am the Duchess, Your Grace," Nell said, because she had decided, somewhere between the wedding breakfast and the locked door, that if she was going to have the title, she was going to use it, and the first person who suggested otherwise would discover that a baronet's daughter who had managed a failing estate since the age of 14 was not a woman who could be outstared by anyone, regardless of age, rank, or the sharpness of their cheekbones. The dowager looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at Mrs. Firth. Then she looked at the terrier, who was investigating a table leg with the dedication of a scholar. "Good," she said. And that was all she said, but she said it the way a general says good when told the cavalry has arrived, and Nell felt something unknot in her chest that had been knotted since the morning she had said yes. The household was, as the Duke had warned, in a state of administrative chaos. This was like saying the sea was damp. The former steward, a Mr. Peck, had departed under circumstances that were described as sudden and were more accurately described as fraudulent. And in his wake, he had left accounts that would have made a bookmaker weep, a rent ledger with more gaps than entries, 3 tenant disputes so old they had begun to grow lichen, and a still room that had not been properly inventoried since the previous century. Nell looked at this catastrophe and felt, for the first time since her father had died, genuinely happy. This was a problem she knew how to solve. This was work she was born for. She had spent 12 years keeping her father's failing estate alive through arithmetic and stubbornness, and the kind of creative economy that involved bartering hay for labor and charm for credit. And she had done it so well that nobody, including her father, had noticed she was doing it at all. Hartmere was the same problem on a grander scale, and Nell approached it the way a surgeon approaches a patient, with steady hands, a clear head, and absolutely no sentiment about what needed cutting. Within a week she had audited the accounts, identified the discrepancies, confronted Mrs. Firth about the wine cellar inventory, which was short by 14 bottles, and the housekeeper's expression suggested she knew exactly where they had gone, resolved 2 of the 3 tenant disputes by the simple method of listening to both sides and then explaining, with devastating patience, exactly what the law actually said, and reorganized the still room from chaos to alphabetical order, which Mrs. Firth regarded with the expression of a woman who had witnessed a miracle and was reserving judgment on whether it was a good one. We will take a very short break. If you do not want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. Chapter 2. The Duke observed these improvements with the particular discomfort of a man who has purchased a clock and discovered it can also compose symphonies. He had expected competence. What he had got was something else entirely. The woman he had married as an act of duty was running his estate better than anyone had run it in 20 years, and she was doing it in a gray dress that she had brought from her father's house, and that was, he could not help noticing, beginning to fray at the cuffs. Nell, for her part, was not noticing anything about the Duke at all. She was certainly not noticing his hands, which were long-fingered and ink-stained, and moved across documents with the precise, unhurried economy of a man who had never in his life fumbled anything. She was not noticing that when he stood at the estate office doorway to review her progress, he stood very straight and very still, and his shoulders in his dark coat had a way of filling the frame of the door that she found, for reasons she declined to investigate, mildly distracting. She was not noticing these things because noticing them would be foolish, and Nell Garrick had not survived 26 years on competence and arithmetic by being foolish. And she was not going to start now, however many door frames the man chose to fill. She added, not noticing, to the long list of things she managed with efficiency, and moved on. He noticed the cuffs because he was not looking at her face. He had made a policy of not looking at her face. Her face had freckles and a particular way of going very still when she was thinking, and he had discovered, during the first week of their marriage, that watching her think was a pastime he could not afford, because it made him want to ask what she was thinking, and asking what she was thinking would be a breach of terms, and Piers Cavell did not breach terms. He had very good terms, excellent terms, terms that kept everything tidy and safe and entirely free of the sort of complication that arose when one began to notice freckles. He had attempted once to discuss the East Meadow drainage with her. This was an estate matter. It was appropriate. It was, in fact, necessary, because the East Meadow flooded every autumn, and the costs were considerable. He had entered the estate office with a prepared memorandum and the absolute certainty that he could discuss water tables with his own wife without incident. She had been leaning over the drainage map. Her pen was between her teeth. A strand of auburn hair had escaped its pins and fallen across her cheek, and she was frowning at the contour lines with the concentrated ferocity of a general studying a battlefield, and she said, without looking up, "The problem is not the sluice. The problem is the gradient from the West Bank. Someone has been measuring from the wrong datum point for at least 6 years." She was right. He could see from where he stood that she was right, and that no one else in 30 years of estate management had noticed. He could also see from where he stood the exact curve of her neck where the hair had fallen, and his prepared memorandum suddenly seemed very far away and very beside the point. "I shall leave the memorandum on your desk," he said. "You could simply tell me what it says. You are here. I find memoranda more efficient. You find them less dangerous, Your Grace. That is a different thing." His mouth did the almost smile. It got closer than usual. It was in fact the closest it had come in living memory, and Nell watched it not arrive with the air of a woman studying a rare meteorological event that would probably not be repeated. The difficulty was the proximity. Hartmere was a large house, but it was not large enough. She was in the breakfast room when he came down. She was in the library when he went to read. She was in the estate office when he went to review the accounts. And when he arrived, she would look up from whatever devastatingly competent thing she was doing and say, "Good morning, Your Grace," in a voice that was perfectly civil. And the civility was worse than coldness, because coldness could be ignored and civility could not. She called him Your Grace. She had never called him anything else. It was correct. It was proper. It made him want to put his fist through the paneling, which was 18th century and irreplaceable, and so he did not. The worst of it, the genuinely worst of it, was the key. She wore it on her chatelaine, alongside the still-room key and the cellar key and the linen cupboard key, and it hung against the gray fabric of her dress and caught the light when she moved. Everyone in the house knew what it was. Everyone in the house knew what the locked door meant. And Nell wore that key as calmly and practically as she wore everything, as though it were simply another piece of household management, which, he supposed, it was. He did not think about the key. He had a strict policy of not thinking about the key. The policy was going about as well as his policy of not looking at her face, which was to say, it was a comprehensive failure that he was maintaining through sheer force of will and increasingly poor sleep. "You are not sleeping," the dowager said, 3 weeks into the marriage, over breakfast. She said it the way she said everything, as though she were commenting on the weather, and the weather happened to be her grandson's entire interior life. "I am sleeping perfectly well, grandmother." "You are drinking your coffee as though it has personally offended you, which is a habit you have had since boyhood, and which means either you are not sleeping or you are angry. And since you have nothing to be angry about except the consequences of your own decisions, I shall assume it is both." Nell, at the far end of the table, turned a page of the estate diary and did not look up. She was, he noticed, and then stopped noticing, suppressing something at the corner of her mouth that might, in a less disciplined woman, have been a smile. Mr. Hugh Taverner arrived at Hartmere on the 1st of November, which was exactly the sort of thing November would do. Hugh was everything Piers was not, and both of them knew it, and only one of them minded. He was broad, ruddy, laughing, and in possession of a voice that filled rooms the way sunlight fills rooms, which is to say, without effort and without apology. He had been Piers's closest friend since Oxford, which said something about Piers that Piers preferred not to examine, namely that somewhere beneath the architecture of his composure there lived a man who liked to laugh and had simply forgotten how. "Cavell, you look like a man who has swallowed a timepiece," Hugh said upon arrival, and then he saw Nell. Hugh Taverner had a gift. The gift was this: he saw people. Not titles, not stations, not the elaborate costuming of social performance. He looked at the Duchess of Hartmere and saw a woman in a gray dress with ink on her fingers and freckles on her nose, and the expression of someone who had been handed the keys to a kingdom and was halfway through reorganizing the treasury. "Your Grace," he said, with a bow that was everything a bow should be and nothing more. "I have been told you have performed miracles with the East Meadow drainage. I should very much like to see it." And Nell, who had been called Your Grace by 43 wedding guests and a dozen servants, and had heard it every time as a title earned on paper, heard Hugh say it, and heard, for the first time, something that sounded almost like it was meant for her, rather than for the woman she was pretending to be. "The drainage is not a miracle, Mr. Taverner. It is arithmetic. But you are welcome to see it." She smiled. Piers, who was standing in the hall and had not been part of this conversation, and had not wished to be part of this conversation, watched his wife smile at another man for the first time in their marriage, and felt something move in his chest that he did not have a name for, and would very much like to have returned to wherever it had come from. Over the following week, Hugh Taverner did 3 things with cheerful, devastating efficiency. He made Nell laugh. He brought her wildflowers from the hedgerow, which he arranged in a chipped jug on the estate office windowsill. And he leaned over the drainage maps beside her, their heads close together, and discussed water tables with the genuine enthusiasm of a man who found water tables interesting. He was not courting her. He was being kind, which was worse, because kindness was harder to object to and impossible to forbid, and Piers Cavell, who had arranged his marriage to eliminate all possibility of emotional complication, found himself in the grip of a complication so severe that he was forced to recategorize it from discomfort to distress, and from distress to something he refused to name, and which presented itself, most unhelpfully, as a strong desire to discuss drainage himself. He did not discuss drainage. He did not bring wildflowers. He sat in his study and reviewed the quarterly accounts and listened, through 2 walls and a locked door, to his wife laughing, and he held his pen so tightly that the nib bent, and he did not feel anything at all, except that the pen would need replacing. The dowager, who missed nothing and commented on everything, watched this performance for 3 days before she said, with the devastating calm of a woman who had waited 83 years for someone in this family to show some sense, "If you break another pen, I shall assume you have developed a new hobby. Shall I order more ink?" Lady Sybil Fenwick arrived for the house party in the 2nd week of November, and she arrived the way weather arrives, with beauty, with inevitability, and with a barometric pressure that made every joint in the house ache. She was the daughter of Viscount Fenwick. She was 29. She was the woman the county had expected Piers to marry for the better part of 5 years, and she had expected it too, which was the only honest thing about her, and the one thing she could not forgive. Sybil was beautiful in the way that paintings are beautiful, composed, luminous, and slightly untouchable. She had fair hair that curled without effort, blue eyes that could convey warmth and appraisal simultaneously, and the kind of figure that made other women feel suddenly conscious of their own. She entered Hartmere wearing a cream silk pelisse that cost more than Nell's entire wardrobe, and smiled at Nell with the perfect practiced warmth of a woman who had spent 5 years preparing to be the Duchess of Hartmere, and was now smiling at the woman who was. "My dear Duchess, how brave you are, managing all this on your own." The sentence was flawless. It was kind, it was warm, it was admiring, and it contained, like a fishbone in a soufflé, the 3 words that would lodge in the county's throat and never quite come out. On your own. Because Nell was on her own. That was the truth Sybil had found, and truth, wielded by a woman who knows how to hold a knife, is the most dangerous weapon in any drawing room. Nell understood what Sybil was doing because Nell had been underestimated by better women than Lady Sybil Fenwick, and had survived by the simple method of doing the work nobody wanted to see, and doing it so well that they had no choice but to acknowledge it afterwards. She understood that Sybil's campaign was not cruelty, it was grief. Sybil had waited. She had been patient and beautiful and correct, and she had been passed over for a woman in a gray dress with ink on her fingers, and the injustice of it was so vast that it had to go somewhere, and it went where pain always goes in polite society, underground, where it dressed itself in kindness and came out as something that looked like concern and cut like glass. But understanding a thing and being proof against it are different, and Nell was not proof against it. She could feel the whispers begin, the way one feels a draft before one sees the window, a coldness at the edges. How brave she is. managing on her own. The door between their rooms, such an unusual arrangement, so modern, so very, very brave. The Michaelmas Assembly was held on the 21st of November. It was the first time the county would see the Duke and Duchess of Hartmere together in public, and the county had been looking forward to it the way a theater audience looks forward to a play about which the reviews have been mixed. Nell dressed for the assembly in a gown of deep slate blue that Mrs. Firth had helped her choose, and that was, she noted with the detachment of a woman who had spent a decade in gray, the most expensive thing she had ever worn. It was not fashionable. It was not ornamental, but it was cut well and made of silk that moved like water. And when she looked at herself in the glass, she saw, for the first time, not a baronet's daughter pretending to be a duchess, but a woman who had earned the right to stand exactly where she was standing, and did not need to apologize for the freckles. The assembly hall was bright with candles and conversation, and both fell silent when they entered. They entered together, because that was the performance. His arm, her hand upon it, his face composed, her face composed. Two people who shared a name and a house and a life, and had not touched each other since the morning he had passed her the salt, walking into a room of 100 people who wanted to know if the rumors were true. The county watched. The county always watched. That was what counties were for. They danced the first dance because they had to. It was a country dance, brisk and formal, requiring only the briefest contact. A hand taken, a hand released, a turn, a bow. But the ballroom was warm, and the music was in 3/4 time, and when his gloved hand closed around hers, Nell felt the contact travel the entire length of her arm and settle somewhere behind her ribs, where it sat, uninvited, and refused to leave. 1 second, 2, 3. He was looking at her, not past her, not through her, not at the carefully maintained middle distance he had perfected over 6 weeks of marriage. At her. And his eyes, which were the gray-green of winter sea, held in them something she had not seen before. Surprise. She did not know what he was surprised by. She did not want to know. Wanting to know was the kind of thing that led to hoping, and she had spent 26 years becoming too sensible for hope, and she was not about to surrender that investment because a man who had specifically agreed never to want her was looking at her as though he had mislaid something important and had just, inconveniently, found it. The dance ended. She released his hand. He released hers. The formal distance returned like a curtain falling, and both of them stood on opposite sides of it and pretended the curtain had always been there and always would be, and neither of them was entirely convincing. Then Hugh asked her to dance. Hugh danced the way he did everything, with warmth and ease, and no apparent awareness that the Duke of Hartmere was standing 12 feet away and watching with an expression that could have frozen the punch bowl. Hugh made her laugh during the allemande, which was technically impossible, and the laugh carried across the room, and the county heard it, and the county noticed that the Duke heard it, and the county drew conclusions, and the conclusions were, for once, approximately correct. Piers Cavell stood at the edge of the assembly hall and watched his wife laugh with another man, and discovered that jealousy, which he had always considered a weakness of temperament and therefore beneath his notice, was neither weak nor beneath him. It was, in fact, the most muscular, most present, most inescapably physical sensation he had experienced since the moment he had taken her hand for the dance, and felt, with a clarity that was almost medical, that he was in a great deal more trouble than he had planned for. He wanted to cross the room. He wanted to tap Hugh on the shoulder and say something that was either very civilized or very much not, and since he could not determine which, he did neither. He stood very straight, he held his glass, and he watched his wife waltz away from him in slate blue silk, and he thought, this is the consequence. You arranged your life so that nothing could reach you, and the thing that has reached you is wearing a gray dress and has freckles, and will never, ever be yours, because you wrote the terms that made it so. A man can build a wall against the world. It takes a particular kind of fool to build one against his own wife. Chapter 3. November settled over Hartmere like a damp gray shawl, and beneath it, something shifted. It did not shift dramatically. There were no declarations, no confrontations, no moments of high theater. It shifted the way ice shifts on a river, invisibly, dangerously, with the quiet certainty that what had been solid was no longer solid, and what came next would not look like what had come before. Piers brought her the tenancy review for the East Holdings without being asked. She had mentioned once, 3 weeks earlier, in a conversation about the barley yield that had lasted 4 minutes and been conducted entirely in the language of agricultural management, that she would need the tenancy review before the quarter. He had remembered. He had placed it on her desk in the estate office, aligned with the edge of the blotter, at 6 in the morning before she arrived. He had not left a note. The review was the note. Nell mended his riding coat. She had found it on the back of the study chair with a torn seam at the shoulder, and she had taken it and mended it and returned it to the same chair, and she had used thread that matched so precisely that a casual observer would not have noticed the repair. But Piers was not a casual observer. Piers noticed that the stitching was finer than his tailor's, and that the thread was the exact shade of charcoal, and that the coat, which had sat torn on that chair for a month because he could not be bothered to send it to be mended, was now whole and carried, very faintly, the scent of lavender that he associated with her rooms, and had trained himself not to notice, and noticed anyway. Hugh Taverner left Hartmere in the 3rd week of November. He left quietly, with a good horse and the instincts of a man who understood more than he would ever say. He shook Piers's hand at the door and said, "You have a remarkable wife, Cavell." "I am aware," Piers said, in the tone of a man who has recently become aware of something at roughly the speed and comfort of being struck by a falling chimney. Hugh looked at him. Hugh smiled. Hugh, who was warm and easy and uncomplicated, said, "Then for the love of everything sensible, tell her so," and rode south, and was gone. The library became their territory. Neither of them planned it. It simply happened the way rain happens, inevitably, without permission, and with no regard for the wishes of the people getting wet. She read at midnight because she could not sleep. He read at midnight because he could not sleep. They arrived separately, discovered each other separately, and after 3 nights of pretending it was a coincidence, stopped pretending, and simply read in the same room, on opposite sides of the fireplace, in silence that was the closest thing to conversation either of them had managed in 7 weeks of marriage. On the 4th night she was reading the agricultural survey of the northern counties, and he was reading Tacitus, and she said, without looking up, "Did you know that the average yield of barley in the East Riding has declined by 1/6 since the turn of the century?" "I did not." "It is a scandal. The drainage alone could correct half the loss." "You are reading the agricultural survey for pleasure." "I am reading it because it is interesting. You are reading Tacitus, who has been dead for 1700 years. I hardly think you are in a position to question my leisure choices, Your Grace." His mouth did the almost smile again. This time it nearly arrived. It hovered at the edge of his expression like a traveler who has come a long way and is not certain of his welcome. Nell, who had been cataloging the almost smile with the same diligence she applied to the household inventory, noted that he was also, in the firelight, unfairly constructed. His shirt sleeves were rolled to the forearm because the library was warm, and the forearms in question were lean and corded, and belonged, she felt quite strongly, on a man who did not have a locked door in his domestic arrangements. The firelight caught the line of his jaw and the angle of his cheekbone and the shadow beneath his collarbones where his shirt fell open at the throat, and she thought, with the grim precision of a woman adding a column of numbers that refused to come out right, "This is extremely inconvenient, and I would like it to stop." It did not stop. She reached for a volume on the shelf beside her, and at the same moment he reached for the same shelf, and their hands met in the space between the books. His fingers brushed hers. Neither of them pulled away. The fire crackled, the clock ticked. His hand was warm and calloused along the ridge of the palm, and hers was ink-stained and steady, and the contact lasted perhaps 3 seconds, and contained more honesty than 2 months of marriage. He withdrew first. She let him. Neither of them mentioned it. But when she returned to the agricultural survey, the words had rearranged themselves into something she could not quite read, and her pulse, which she had always considered a reliable mechanism, was behaving as though it had somewhere urgent to be. The Dowager watched all of this from the vantage point of 83 years and the window seat in the upstairs gallery, which overlooked the library through a gap in the curtain that she had arranged herself in the autumn of the previous year, when her grandson had first begun to show signs of being irretrievably stupid. She said nothing. She said nothing with such volume and such precision that the entire household heard it. And the entire household, from Mrs. Firth to the boot boy, began to take a quiet professional interest in the number of candles required in the library after midnight, which increased, over the course of November, from 2 to 4 to 6. Because a woman who reads in inadequate light will ruin her eyes, and Mrs. Firth was not going to have that on her conscience. Thank you very much. The Dowager, meanwhile, had formed her own opinion of the situation and delivered it to the terrier, who was the only member of the household she considered a reliable confidant. He has married a woman with the mind of a chancellor and the spine of a dragoon, she said, and he is treating the matter as an inconvenience of estate management. If his grandfather were alive, I would have him horsewhipped. The terrier, who had no strong views on the subject, ate a biscuit. Lady Sybil's campaign reached its zenith on the 28th of November, at a tea hosted by Mrs. Alderton of Briar Lodge, where the conversation turned, with the inevitability of a clock striking, to the new Duchess. Of course, one admires her immensely, Sybil said, stirring her tea with a spoon that did not need stirring. Managing that enormous house entirely alone. The Duke is so often occupied with his own affairs, and there is so much to manage without, well, she paused. She did not say, without a real marriage. She did not need to. The pause said it for her, and the pause was heard by 9 women, each of whom told 3 others, and by the end of the week the county knew, or believed it knew, that the Duke and Duchess of Hartmere kept separate rooms, separate lives, and a locked door between them, and the Duchess was very brave, very capable, and very much alone. The whispers reached Nell on a Wednesday. She was reviewing the timber accounts when Mrs. Firth appeared with tea and a face that suggested the tea was not the purpose of the visit. "They are saying, Your Grace, that you and His Grace do not, that is to say, that the arrangements in the house are not, that is." Mrs. Firth, who could terrify a footman at 40 paces, could not finish the sentence. "They are saying the door is locked," Nell said. "Yes, Mrs. Firth, the door is locked. It has been locked since the day I arrived. Is there anything else?" There was nothing else. Mrs. Firth withdrew. Nell sat very still for a moment, her pen suspended above the timber accounts, and felt the particular cold of a woman who has built a careful life on careful terms, and has just discovered that the terms, which she had accepted to preserve her dignity, were now the thing destroying it. She found him in the study that evening. He was reading his father's letter, which she knew because she had seen the paper before, once, on the day he had proposed, and she had recognized the hand as her own father's friend's, and had understood, without being told, that the letter was the reason for everything. "Your Grace." He put the letter away. His face closed like a door. His face was, she reflected, very good at being a door. It was perhaps the most practiced door in England, and she was tired of knocking. "I wish to discuss our arrangement. Is there a difficulty with the household accounts? The tenancy review should be on your desk. I placed it there this morning." "At 6 in the morning. Yes. I found it. It was beautifully aligned with the blotter. I wish to discuss our arrangement." He was silent. His silence was a particular kind of silence, the kind that takes up space and has opinions and costs a great deal of effort to maintain, and she had learned, over 8 weeks of marriage, to read his silences the way she read ledgers, by what was missing. "You gave me your name," she said. "You gave me your house and your title and your household keys and a wardrobe allowance and a sitting room with 14 windows and a bed I sleep in alone. and you have given me every single thing a duchess could require, and you have given me nothing." His hand, resting on the desk, closed into a fist and then, slowly, opened. "You have been generous," she said. "You have been scrupulously fair. You have been honorable and decent and correct, and you have not once, in 8 weeks, looked at me as though I were a person you chose rather than a problem you solved. And I am telling you now, Your Grace, that I would rather have had one honest conversation than 14 windows." She did not wait for his answer. She had not come for an answer. She had come to say the thing, and she had said it, and she left the room with her back straight and her hands steady and her heart doing something that was not, strictly speaking, any of her heart's business. And she did not cry until she had reached her own rooms and locked the door, and even then she did it quietly, because she had been doing everything quietly for 26 years and was not about to stop now. Piers sat in his study and did not move for a long time. He took out the letter. His father's hand, angular and impatient. "See to the Garrick girl. She will need someone and she will not ask. You know me well enough to know I would do it myself if I were not, at the moment, inconveniently dying. She is the best of William and the best of her mother, and if you let her disappear into a governess post or a cousin's back bedroom, I will haunt you, Piers, and I will not be a pleasant ghost." He read it again. He had read it 400 times. He had read it as a duty. He had read it as a summons. He had never, until tonight, read it as what it actually was, which was a love letter, written by a dying man about a girl he had known since she was born, and loved as his own. And the love letter did not say, "Marry her," and it did not say, "Provide for her," and it did not say, "Arrange a tidy legal solution that allows you to discharge your obligation without ever actually looking at her." The letter said, "She will need someone." Not something. Someone. His father had known. His father, who could not keep his own accounts, and whose idea of estate management was to hire someone cleverer and then argue with them about everything, had known the one thing that Piers, with his precision and his plans and his beautifully aligned tenancy reviews, had missed entirely. That Eleanor Garrick did not need a house, or a title, or a wardrobe allowance, or 14 windows. She needed to be seen, and he had arranged, with spectacular efficiency, never to see her at all. He put his head in his hands. His hands were ink-stained and long-fingered, and had recently, without his conscious involvement, learned the precise weight and temperature of hers through a single layer of evening gloves during a dance that had lasted 4 minutes and would, he suspected, last a great deal longer in his memory. We will take a very short break. If you do not want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. Chapter 4. December arrived, and with it the kind of cold that makes the north of England feel like a personal rebuke from the weather. The becks froze. The fields went rigid. Hartmere itself seemed to contract, pulling its inhabitants closer together by the simple mechanism of making every room without a fire uninhabitable. The library, which had 2 fires and was therefore the warmest room in the house, became, by default and by silent agreement, the only room in which the Duke and Duchess could exist in the same space, without the space itself feeling accusatory. They had not spoken about the 14 windows. They had not spoken about the locked door, the separate rooms, the county's whispers, or the fact that Mrs. Firth was now leaving 6 candles in the library every evening, with the pointed hopefulness of a woman who believes that if you give 2 people enough light, eventually one of them will use it to see the other. What they spoke about was the estate, the Michaelmas rents, the timber contract, the tenant cottages, and slowly, by degrees neither of them acknowledged, they began to speak about other things. She told him about her father's garden, the roses that grew despite every effort to kill them, the bee skep her father had kept and never once managed without getting stung. He told her about the library at Oxford, where he had read for 7 hours without standing, and emerged into daylight with the distinct impression that the sun was being unreasonably bright. She laughed. He looked at her as though the sound was something he would very much like to hear again, and had absolutely no idea how to cause. "You might try saying something amusing on purpose," she said, "rather than waiting for it to happen to you by accident." "I was not aware it was happening by accident." "That, Your Grace, is precisely the problem." They fell into a routine that neither of them named and both of them needed. Morning in the estate office, where they reviewed accounts side by side, and her elbow was 3 inches from his, and both of them were aware of the 3 inches the way a cartographer is aware of a border. Afternoon apart, because afternoon apart was in the terms, and the term still existed, technically, in the way a fence exists after the field has already been crossed. Evening in the library, where the fires burned and the candles multiplied, and the distance between their chairs decreased by imperceptible degrees, as though the chairs themselves were conducting negotiations that their occupants lacked the courage to begin. One evening she dropped her pen. He retrieved it. He held it out. She took it, and their fingers overlapped, and neither of them let go for a beat longer than retrieving a pen required, and she said, "Thank you, Your Grace." And he said, "You are welcome, madam." And the exchange was so elaborately, so preposterously formal, given that they were sitting 2 feet apart in firelight, and she was wearing her dressing gown, and he had ink on his jaw, that she made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh, and was, she realized with some alarm, the sound of a woman who is in a great deal more trouble than the terms allow for. He heard the sound. His hand, still holding the empty air where the pen had been, closed slowly, as though keeping the warmth of her fingers in his fist. "You have ink on your jaw," she said. "Where?" "There." She raised her hand. She did not touch him. She pointed very precisely at the smudge of ink on the left side of his jaw, her finger an inch from his skin. And the inch was the most populated inch in England, containing as it did the entire history of their arrangement, and the entire future of whatever this was becoming. And she held her finger there for perhaps 2 seconds, and then withdrew it, and returned to her agricultural survey as though nothing had happened. Which was technically true and emotionally fraudulent. Piers sat very still. Then he raised his own hand and wiped the ink from his jaw with his thumb. And the gesture was, she could not help noticing from behind the agricultural survey she was not reading, oddly tender, as though he were touching the place where her finger had almost been. This, Nell thought, is going to be a problem. This is going to be a considerable problem. She turned a page of the survey she had read 3 times already and added, "falling in love with my contractual husband," to the long list of things she was managing with efficiency, somewhere between the timber contract and the quarterly accounts. And she did not look at his jaw again for the rest of the evening, which required a degree of self-discipline she had previously reserved for not eating the last of the butter during a lean winter. The tenant cottages required inspection, and the inspection required both of them, because Nell had the costs and Piers had the authority, and neither worked without the other, which was becoming a pattern they were both pretending not to notice. They rode out together on a morning so cold that the horse's breath hung in the air like small white flags of surrender. The track to the east cottages was narrow, flanked by frozen hedgerow, and the horses walked close, and Nell's knee, in its riding habit, was 6 inches from his, and the 6 inches were doing the same thing the 3 inches had done in the estate office, which was to shrink. At the first cottage, old Mr. Hatch came to the door and looked at the Duke, and looked at the Duchess, and looked at the narrow gap between them and said, with the devastating simplicity of a man who has farmed the same land for 50 years and has no patience for the maneuvers of his betters, "About time you came together. The roof wants doing, and I have been writing to both of you separately for weeks and getting the same answer twice." Nell, who had written to Mr. Hatch about the roof. Piers, who had also written to Mr. Hatch about the roof. Neither of them had known the other had written. Both letters had promised the same repairs, at the same cost, on the same timeline. They were, it appeared, running the estate in perfect parallel, without coordinating, which was either impressive administration or the most elaborate form of courtship in the history of the English countryside. "We will attend to the roof, Mr. Hatch," Piers said. Together, I hope, said Mr. Hatch. Saves the postage. On the ride back, Nell said nothing for a quarter of a mile, and then she said, We wrote the same letter. We did. The same cost estimate, the same mason, the same delivery date for the lime. It appears we did. That is either very efficient or very alarming, Your Grace. It is both, he said. And then, very quietly, almost to himself but not quite, most of the important things are. She looked at him. He was looking ahead, at the frozen track, at the bare trees, at the winter sky that was the same gray-green as his eyes, and his profile in the cold air was sharp and composed and very slightly undone at the edges, like a letter that has been folded and refolded so many times that the creases have begun to soften. And she thought, Oh, there you are. I have been looking for you for a long time, and you have been here all along, and I did not see you because you were standing too close. She did not say this. She said, The lime order still needs your signature. I will sign it this evening. After Tacitus? Before Tacitus. The lime is more urgent. That may be the most romantic thing you have ever said to me, Your Grace. She had meant it as a joke. She was almost sure she had meant it as a joke. But his almost smile, which had been advancing by degrees all morning, reached a new position, closer to actual arrival than she had ever witnessed, and she thought, with the particular panic of a woman who has just accidentally told the truth in the shape of a joke. Well, that was careless. And somewhere in the middle of all of this, in the estate office at midnight, or the library at dawn, or the corridor where their shoulders nearly touched as they passed, both of them arrived, separately and without consultation, at the same conclusion. This cannot continue. The terms were still in place, the door was still locked, and the terms in the door were becoming with each day less like a boundary and more like a lie. And neither of them had ever been able to tolerate a lie. It was the Dowager who finally said the thing, because the Dowager always said the thing, and because 83 years of watching people make the same mistakes had given her a limited tolerance for the particular stupidity of pride. She found Piers alone in the morning room, staring at the frost on the windows with the expression of a man who has recently discovered that frost is beautiful and would very much like it to stop being beautiful because beauty is inconvenient. Piers, she said. She did not call him Your Grace. She had not called him Your Grace since he was 7. You are behaving like your grandfather, who spent 40 years being honorable at your grandmother and then died, and your grandmother said at the funeral, He was a good man, and I wish to heaven he had been a happy one. And I have thought about that sentence every day since, and I am tired of watching it happen twice. He did not answer. She wears the key on her chatelaine, the Dowager said. Every day, in plain sight. She carries the key to a door she cannot open alone, and you have given her no reason to try. I have lived too long to watch this, Piers. I have lived too long for many things, but I have lived too long for this specifically. She left the room. The terrier followed. The frost remained. The Winter Assembly fell on the 14th of December, and it was at the Winter Assembly that Lady Sybil Fenwick discovered the difference between a narrative and the truth, which is that a narrative requires maintenance and the truth does not. Sybil had been patient. She had been careful. She had laid her campaign with the skill of a woman who understood that the most effective weapon in polite society is not a lie, but a truth delivered at the right angle. And the truth she delivered, on the afternoon before the assembly, to Mrs. Alderton and Mrs. Pembroke and the Honorable Miss Lydia Crane, was this: that the Duchess of Hertford had begged the Duke to marry her, that the arrangement had been her desperate scheme to secure a title and a fortune, that poor Piers had been trapped by obligation and his father's dying wish, and the Duchess, clever girl, had used both to claw her way from a bankrupt estate to the grandest house in the county. It was built on truth. Nell had benefited. The marriage had been an arrangement. The dying wish had been real. The facts, seen from a certain angle, in a certain light, with a certain emphasis, told exactly the story Sybil wanted told, that the Duchess of Hartmere was not brave but calculating, not competent but scheming, not overlooked but overly ambitious. Nell heard the story from Mrs. Firth, who heard it from the cook, who heard it from the greengrocer's wife, who heard it from Miss Crane, who had heard it from Lady Sybil Fenwick directly, and had repeated it with the helpless enthusiasm of a woman who had never, in her life, been trusted with anything interesting before. Nell listened. She put down her pen, she closed the accounts book, and she said very quietly, to no one but herself and the empty estate office, "Right then." She did not plan a speech. She did not plan a confrontation. She planned what she always planned, the next thing that needed doing, which was attending the winter assembly as the Duchess of Hartmere. What she did not plan for was peers. The assembly hall was full. The county had turned out in force, because the county had heard the story, and the county wanted to see what would happen next. And the county was not, on the whole, ashamed of this, because curiosity is only vulgar when someone calls it that, and no one had. Nell wore the slate blue silk. She wore the chatelaine with its keys. She wore the key. She walked into the room with her chin level and her hands steady, because consistency was the only argument that could not be talked over. And if the county wanted evidence, the evidence was standing in front of them in slate blue silk and had reorganized the still room. And then Piers crossed the room. He did not cross it quickly. He crossed it at the deliberate, unhurried pace of a man who has made a decision and intends the decision to be visible. The county watched. The county always watched. And what the county saw was the Duke of Hartmere walk the entire length of the assembly hall, past Lady Sybil Fenwick, past Mrs. Alderton, past the Honorable Miss Lydia Crane, and stop at his wife's side, and stay there. He offered his arm. She looked at it. She looked at him. His face was not composed. His face was doing the thing where the door wanted to open, and this time the door was open, and behind it was something she had not seen before, which was a man who had stopped being careful and had started being present. She took his arm. "You are here," she said quietly, "for him alone." "I have been a fool for approximately 12 weeks, he said. "I thought I should stop." "That is a reasonable conclusion. Your method of arriving at it has been somewhat inefficient." "I am aware. I believe there is a woman who could help me improve my efficiency. She reorganized my still room alphabetically in a single afternoon." He was, she realized, making a joke. Piers Cavell, Duke of Hartmere, the man who did not know he was funny, was deliberately, consciously, with full awareness of what he was doing, making a joke. It was a terrible joke. It was the best thing she had ever heard. He danced with her. He danced with her twice, which, in the particular arithmetic of the assembly hall, meant something so specific that even Mrs. Alderton, who was not noted for her interpretive abilities, understood it. A gentleman dances once with a woman out of duty. He dances twice with a woman out of choice. The Duke of Hartmere, who had danced once with his wife at the Michaelmas Assembly with the air of a man fulfilling a contractual obligation, now danced with her a second time with the air of a man who could not think of a single reason to let go of her hand, and was not, at this moment, interested in thinking of one. During the second dance, his hand settled at the small of her back for the turn, and the hand stayed a beat longer than the dance required, and Nell felt the warmth of his palm through the silk and thought, with the grim clarity of a woman who has been managing the unmanageable for 12 weeks, "Well, this is not in the terms either, and I find I do not care." He introduced her to Lord Pemberton, who had ridden over from the next county. He said, "Lord Pemberton, may I present my wife, who has done more for the Hartmere estate in 3 months than I managed in 3 years." He said it as a fact. He said it the way he said everything, precisely, without ornament, without performance. He meant it. The room heard him mean it. The county drew conclusions. The conclusions were, for once, approximately correct. Lady Sybil, who had spent the afternoon constructing a narrative in which the Duke and Duchess were strangers trapped in a loveless arrangement, watched the Duke stand at his wife's side for the entire evening, watched him dance with her twice, watched him introduce her with genuine pride, and felt her narrative come apart the way a letter comes apart in rain. Slowly, and then all at once, and then it was nothing but pulp. The Dowager, who had been sitting by the wall with her terrier and her cane, leaned toward Mrs. Alderton and said, with the carrying calm of a woman who understood that volume is for amateurs, "What a charming evening! I understand there was some concern about the state of my grandson's marriage. One does hope the concern has been resolved, Mrs. Alderton. I should hate for anyone to find themselves continuing a conversation that the principals have so clearly concluded." Mrs. Alderton, who had hosted the tea party at which Sybil's story had first been aired, went the particular shade of white that indicates a woman recalculating her social position at speed. The assembly continued. Peers remained at Nell's side. They spoke to the tenants, they spoke to the neighbors, they spoke to each other, in the low, practical murmur of two people discussing lime deliveries and cottage repairs, which was not romantic by any conventional measure and was, by every measure that mattered, the most intimate conversation in the room. Nell found Sybil in the card room, alone. Sybil was sitting by the window, her hands folded, her beautiful face composed in the particular blankness of a woman whose campaign has not been defeated but made irrelevant, which is worse, because a defeat can be argued with, and irrelevance cannot. Nell sat down across from her. She did not gloat. She did not address the whisper campaign. She did not acknowledge it at all, because acknowledging it would have given it weight. And the most devastating thing you can do to a weapon is to treat it as though it was never dangerous. "Lady Sybil," she said, "I have been meaning to speak to you about a practical matter." Sybil looked at her with the wary expression of a woman who has been outflanked and is waiting for the killing blow. "My cousin Harriet lives in Bath. She is a widow with a large house and very little patience for convention. She is in need of a companion whose social abilities exceed her own, and she is prepared to compensate generously. I have written to her about you. About me. You are 29, unmarried, accomplished, and wasted in this county. You have spent 5 years waiting for a life that will not arrive, and the waiting is eating you alive. I know this because I spent 12 years doing the same thing." Sybil's composed face did not crack, but her hands in her lap unfolded, and the unfolding said everything the face would not. "I am not offering you charity. I am offering you an exit, a paid position, a city where no one knows your history, a beginning. Whether you take it is your affair, but the letter is written, and I did not make the offer because I am kind, Lady Sybil. I made it because I am practical, and the practical thing to do with a woman of your talents is to put them to use somewhere they will be appreciated, rather than leaving them here to curdle into something neither of us wants." That was the destruction, not a public humiliation, not a confrontation. An exit offered with such clinical, devastating practicality that refusing it would require Sybil to admit, out loud, that she would rather stay and be bitter than leave and be free, and that was a thing no woman with pride could say. Sybil's eyes were bright. She was not crying. She was doing the thing that women of her training do when the composure cracks from the inside. She was holding very still and breathing carefully, and pretending that the stillness was choice rather than the last defense against collapse. "Why?" she whispered. "Because I have been where you are," Nell said, "and someone saw me, and it changed everything, and I am not in the business of pretending I got here alone." She stood. She smoothed her skirt. She left the card room without looking back, because looking back would have been kind, and kindness was not what Sybil needed. What Sybil needed was a door, and Nell had opened one, and walking through it was Sybil's work, not hers. Piers had not seen the conversation in the card room, but he had seen its prelude, and he would see its aftermath. And what he had seen at the assembly, standing at his wife's side for the first time in 3 months of marriage, was this: a woman who wore her competence like armor and her dignity like a gown, and who had walked into a room full of whispers and refused to acknowledge them. Not because she had not heard, but because she was too busy being the thing they said she was not. She had not corrected the county. She had not defended herself. She had stood beside him and discussed lime deliveries in a voice so steady and so certain that the whispers had died of irrelevance, which was a quieter death than confrontation and a more permanent one. He went home. He did not wait for her. He went home and stood in his study and looked at the locked door and thought about terms and about walls and about a woman who had carried a key for 3 months without once asking him to open the door because she had too much pride to ask for what should have been given freely. Chapter 5. He went to her rooms at midnight, not through the connecting door, through the corridor. He knocked. He knocked the way a man knocks who has spent his entire adult life not knocking, carefully, as though the sound might shatter something. She opened the door in a dressing gown. Her hair was down. He had never seen her hair down. It was auburn, the particular color between red and brown that cannot decide what it is, and it fell past her shoulders in a way that made his chest hurt. And the hurt was not unpleasant, which was the most alarming thing that had happened to him in a day that had included several alarms. "Your Grace," she said. The formality was automatic. It was also, he realized, a shield, and he had given her every reason to carry it. "I would like," he said, and then stopped. He was a man who had never been at a loss for words because he had never attempted to say anything that mattered. Estate management did not require vulnerability. Drainage did not demand honesty. He had spent 32 years perfecting the art of speaking without revealing, and he was now standing in a doorway in his shirt sleeves, trying to say the one thing that required him to be, for the first time in his life, entirely without armor. "I would like to tell you what I have seen," he said. She did not invite him in. She did not close the door. She stood in the doorway with her hair down and her shield up, and she waited, because she had learned over 12 years of patience that waiting was the one thing she did better than anyone, even when the waiting hurt. "I have seen you mend my coat with threads so fine the repair was invisible. I have seen you negotiate a mason in Whitby and a lime purchase in one afternoon and save the estate £14, which you noted in the margin of the accounts ledger in handwriting so small I needed a glass to read it. I have seen you sit with Mrs. Firth for an hour while she cried about her sister. And I have seen you settle a dispute between 2 tenants by the method of reading them their own lease until they were too embarrassed to argue. I have seen you count to 3 before you answer a question you find stupid, which means I have seen you count to 3 a great many times in my presence, and I deserve every one of them." He stopped. He was breathing as though he had run the length of the house, which, in a way, he had. "I have seen you wear the key every day. I have seen you carry it in plain sight as though it were simply another household obligation, and I have understood, too late, that it was never a key. It was a question, and you asked it every day by wearing it, and I was too proud or too frightened or too comprehensively stupid to hear it." Her eyes were bright. She was not crying. She was doing the thing she always did, which was holding the feeling steady, keeping it level, refusing to let it spill because spillage was waste, and she had never been able to afford waste. But her chin was trembling, very slightly, and the trembling undid him the way nothing else could, because it was so small, and she was trying so hard to stop it, and the trying was the bravest thing he had ever seen. "I do not want terms," he said. "I do not want an arrangement. I want to sit with you in the library at midnight, because I cannot sleep when I know you are awake on the other side of a door I locked because I was afraid. And I am telling you this because you walked into a room full of whispers tonight and did not flinch, and I owe you at least the same courage." She was quiet for a long time. The corridor was dark. A single candle burned in her room behind her, and the light caught the key on her chatelaine, and the key was very bright. "You are asking me," she said, carefully, the way she said everything, "to love a man who arranged his life so that love would be impossible, and is now standing in my doorway in his shirt sleeves, asking me to rearrange it. Yes. That is a very great deal to ask, Your Grace. I know. It is also, she said, and her voice cracked, very slightly, on the word also, which was the only time in 3 months of marriage that her voice had cracked, the first honest thing you have said to me since you passed the salt. She reached for the chatelaine, she unclipped the key, she held it out to him, and her hand was steady, and her eyes were not, and the distance between them was 1/4 of an inch, and the whole of a marriage. Open it from your side, she said. That was always the point, Piers. His name, his given name, the formal architecture of 8 weeks of Your Grace, demolished by a single word, spoken softly, in a dark corridor, by a woman who had been carrying a key to a door she could not open alone. He took the key. His hand closed around hers. He did not let go. They stood like that for a moment, in the dark corridor, his fingers wrapped around hers and the key between them, and the moment was not dramatic. It was not grand. It was 2 people standing very close together in a hallway at midnight, holding a piece of iron that had meant loneliness for 3 months, and now meant something else. And the something else did not have a name yet, but it was warm, and it was theirs. Come, she said. She led him by the hand, through her sitting room and across the carpet to the connecting door. She stood aside. The door was heavy oak, the same door it had always been, the same brass lock plate, the same keyhole. Nothing about the door had changed. Everything about the people standing in front of it had. He put the key in the lock. He turned it. The mechanism was stiff from 3 months of disuse, and then it gave, and the bolt drew back with a sound that was very small and very final, and the door swung open on its hinges, and behind it was his room, lit by the fire he had left burning, and the light from both rooms met in the doorway and merged. He turned to her. She was standing in the candlelight with her auburn hair loose and her eyes bright, and the chatelaine at her waist now missing 1 key, and she looked like a woman who had been waiting for something for a very long time, and had just, at last, heard it arrive. Nell, he said, her name, not Madam, not Your Grace, Nell. He said it the way he said everything that mattered, plainly, without ornament, as though the word itself were enough. She stepped toward him. He stepped toward her. The distance closed. His hands, those long-fingered, ink-stained, capable hands that mended gates and aligned blotters, and had spent 3 months learning not to reach for her, rose and cradled her face, and his thumbs traced the freckles on her cheekbones, and she closed her eyes, and for the first time in 3 months of marriage, there was no distance between them at all. He kissed her. It was not the kind of kiss that belongs in a ballroom or a drawing room or any room where other people are present. It was the kind of kiss that belongs in a doorway at midnight between 2 people who have been too proud and too careful and too afraid, and who have finally stopped. Her hands came up and gripped the front of his shirt, and she pulled him closer, and his arms went around her, and the key fell from his hand and rang on the floorboards, and neither of them noticed, because the door was open and the distance was gone, and they were, at last, exactly where they had always been meant to be. After a time that neither of them measured, because measuring things was what they did when they were being careful, and they were no longer being careful, she pulled back, just far enough to see his face. His composure was in ruins. His hair was disordered. His expression was the expression of a man who has been struck by something he had seen coming for months and had still, somehow, not been prepared for. That, she said, was considerably better than passing the salt. He laughed. Piers Cavell, Duke of Hartmere, who did not laugh, who had an almost smile that never quite arrived, who treated the world with the grave precision of a man who found levity structurally unsound, laughed. It was a real laugh, startled and warm and slightly breathless, and it was the best sound she had ever heard, better even than the bolt drawing back, and she kissed him again because she could, because the door was open, because the terms were done, because he was hers, and she was his, and neither of them would be sleeping alone tonight, or any night after. On Christmas morning, the Dowager Duchess of Hartmere came down to breakfast and found two place settings at the same end of the table, close together, touching almost. She looked at Mrs. Firth. Mrs. Firth looked at the Dowager. Neither of them said anything. The terrier investigated a toast rack. Piers entered first. Then Nell, who was wearing a dress of deep green that was new and had been chosen, the Dowager noted, by someone who liked the color green because someone else had once said, in a conversation about drainage that had somehow become a conversation about everything, that green suited her. They sat down. They sat close. His hand, under the table, found hers, and their fingers laced together with the quiet ease of a gesture that had been practiced, recently and often, and no longer needed to be thought about. And Piers Cavell, 6th Duke of Hartmere, who had spent 32 years perfecting the art of the almost smile, who had proposed and declined and reconsidered and rejected more smiles than any man in England, looked at his wife across the breakfast table and smiled. It was not an almost smile. It was not a near miss or a procedural postponement or a fleeting approximation. It was a real, full, unhesitating smile, and it changed his entire face. And Nell, who had been cataloging his expressions since the wedding breakfast the way she cataloged everything, added this one to the ledger and marked it, in the smallest, neatest handwriting, priceless. The Dowager looked at the locked door upstairs, which was, she happened to know because she had checked, open. It had been open for 11 days. Not that she was counting. She was 83 years old and had better things to do than count. She had counted anyway. The brass still wants doing, she said, and drank her tea. The county, over the course of the winter, revised its opinion of the Duchess of Hartmere. This was not difficult. Counties revise their opinions with the same ease and the same lack of shame with which they form them. And by Candlemas, the county had decided that it had always known the Duke and Duchess were in love, that the whole business with the arrangement had been greatly exaggerated, and that anyone who had ever suggested otherwise was being unkind, and the county was never unkind, and if you believed otherwise, you had clearly not been paying attention. The key was mounted above the mantelpiece in the library. No one asked about it. No one needed to. It hung there, small and plain and unremarkable, and it caught the firelight in the evenings, and it meant what it had always meant, which was, the door is open. It has always been open. The only question was, who would be brave enough to walk through it? In Bath, Lady Sybil Fenwick was seen at the assemblies in the company of a naval captain, whose conversation was warm and whose attention was uncomplicated. And if she sometimes thought of Hartmere, she thought of it the way one thinks of a storm that has passed, with relief, and with the particular gratitude of a woman who has been shown kindness when she expected punishment and has not forgotten it. And in the library at Hartmere, at midnight, 2 candles burned instead of 6, because 2 people reading together need less light than 2 people reading alone. And Mrs. Firth, who had been leaving 6 candles every evening for 3 months, with the dogged optimism of a woman who believes in the restorative properties of adequate illumination, reduced the order without comment, and the saving of 4 candles per night amounted to a considerable economy over the course of a year. And the Duchess, who still kept the accounts, noted it in the ledger with the smallest, neatest handwriting in England, and smiled. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you are watching from and what the story made you feel. Do not forget to subscribe so you will not miss new stories.